What's up, guys? Thank you for hopping on this. If you're watching it, it's probably Thursday or Friday, September 4th or 5th, depending on what period you're in. Sub instructions today are just to simply follow along and watch this Screencastify for your Chapter 8 notes, which will be done very similar to class teaching. There are going to be a couple times I stop you, maybe have you watch a video, answer a question, that kind of thing, so make sure you're paying attention. But when you're done with this, there's a quick little activity, but beyond that, I want you to have time today to work on your Chapter 8 study guides, update anything missing from Chapter 6 or 7, because as I hopefully mentioned before I left on my trip, you are going to have a Chapter 6, 7, and 8 reading quiz, most likely Wednesday and Thursday next week, but if there's a delay in the trip or whatever, it might be Friday or Monday, but plan mentally for it to be Wednesday and Thursday. This chapter right here is arguably one of the, if not the most important of the entire year, because it's Constitution stuff, it's building America stuff, and I think it really sets a foundation for curriculum moving forward in this class. So great news about these recorded videos is you can put me at the speeds you need. So if speed up a little bit, if I'm going too fast, of course you can utilize the pause button, closed captions, that kind of thing. Follow along. I do have a little bit of a cold as I record this, so if I sniffle a little bit or take a little break on speaking, that's kind of why. But do your best. I'll try to keep it as tight of a time as I possibly can. America wins the revolution. We're our new, brand new country. We got a fresh start, and the big line from Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, is a bedrock for the U.S. moving forward, even to this day. But the whatabouts, if you will, the whatabouts start pretty quickly. What about slavery? What about women? What about Native Americans? What does it mean when we're saying all men are created equal? As far as women goes, in this time the term Republican motherhood was often used to define the roles of women. The idea was mothers raised or would be responsible for raising future great American citizens and leaders within the Republic. They would keep the nation's conscience. I always use this painting on the left to exemplify Republican motherhood. You have the men staring off to the distance, worried about the political and economic decisions of the day, but the woman is ingrained in the relationship building with her children, not in the political and economic spheres, but in molding future Americans. With abolition, it's actually beginning to take hold. It's not something that just pops up out of nowhere with Abraham Lincoln right before the Civil War. In fact, with its Quaker influence, Pennsylvania passed a gradual abolition act as early as 1780, which would phase out slavery through the releasing or freeing of kids of slaves. States like Vermont, Massachusetts would follow from there in the decades to follow, and outright ban the practice of slavery along with some other northern states in the next 10, 25 years. Of course, the South, it was still ingrained and growing well into the 1800s. Again, pause me, speed me up, whatever you need to do to get the notes filled out. Little Benjamin Lay, he was an abolitionist, Quaker, dwarf vegetarian. Look him up, an actual person that existed in American history. Now, during the Revolution, Congress called on the 13, colonies at the time to make their own constitutions in the same year that the Declaration was passed. And states took this and ran with it. And many of them created decent governments that were often designed to be the opposite of what England had. Strong legislative branches and weak executive or governor branches, weak judges, things like that. Many states individually crafted something that looked like a Bill of Rights, and in a sign of growing democracy, Massachusetts sent their constitution directly to its citizens, or at least voting citizens, for approval. That being said, don't get it confused. During the American Revolution, each colony was basically its own individual nation, loosely tied at the hip with the other states fighting the British in the Revolution. As you learn in past chapters, there were many people on the fence. There were even people loyal to the British Crown still in the years of the Revolution. So to say that we were the United States of America during the Revolution might be a little bit of a stretch, considering during the early years of the Revolution, most colonies operated as their own individual entities. I have 3 videos linked in this lesson. I would say 2 are optional and 1 is a must watch. I would consider this articles video one of the optional ones. I do have it linked. Feel free to watch it if you want more on the articles. Speaking of the Articles of Confederation, because the whole have your own constitution thing was not going to last very long, Congress decided to make something more permanent, or at least attempt to make something more permanent, that would band the 13 states together with a central government. Couple reasons they did this. One, Western land and the expansion of it, presuming that the revolution would be won, was a key driving force. And then secondly, the war was very expensive. One challenge from breaking from King George and the English crown was that we had to pay for stuff now that the English were not going to anymore. One of which was the war we were fueling against them. And as the revolution continued, especially in the back years, the war became very expensive, and America's government or the individual states really struggled to borrow money to fuel the war. There were a lot of financial problems in the back part of the revolution. The articles were a nice first attempt, but they did not last. In fact, look at the years at the top of this slide. The articles don't last even until the 1790s. And what it's going to do is it's going to be the beta version, the iOS 1.0, and a precursor to what ultimately is created that does last, aka the U.S. Constitution. So the first part of this chapter tells you why the articles failed. The second half tells you how the Constitution was built and why it's lasted for so long in American history. One success in the years under the Articles of Confederation was actually how they divvied up Western land, and it comes through 2 ordinances. The first in 1785 basically started to shape what we would know as the Midwest today, including the state of Indiana. They divided up land in places that would become like the Ohio Territory into grids and boxes. You can see the picture over here on the right, and you could purchase quarter sections, half sections. They would usually set aside one of them for public schools and things like that. And to raise money or collect money, you would purchase off territory, move there, the government would be funded or be able to pay off national debts from the war, and then these territories would become populated. To go along with this land ordinance was also the Northwest Ordinance. We would know it as the Midwest today, but it was known as the Northwest back then. That created a phasing in basically process for these areas to become official states, as you can see labeled with the years in parentheses on that map on the right. 60,000 was usually the benchmark for becoming a state. You would apply to the government under the Articles of Confederation, and Ohio would go first, Wisconsin last, and the others would fill in from there. Surprisingly, in the Northwest Territory, slavery was banned. Part of it was the North was already phasing out the practice. There wasn't as much need for them in what would become the modern day Midwest. And then also, the southern states don't have as much political power as they're going to have in the years surrounding the Civil War, so they can't exactly fight against this. And 2, even some slaveholding states like Virginia were okay with slavery being banned because they didn't necessarily want the agricultural competition to emerge in these new states. They kind of wanted a monopoly on it, which is another reason slavery was actually able to be banned at such an early part of American history, albeit in a small region, not the entire country. The Articles of Confederation were more or less a disaster, and there's a reason they last 8 years. One, under the Articles of Confederation, the 13 states had no uniform system of currency or power to actually do federal taxes, which is one of the biggest reasons you have a government in the first place. That is equivalent with currency if you go on a trip this fall break and you go to Lake Michigan and you go to a restaurant and they say, we don't take dollars, we need Michigan bucks. Because state to state, they would have different financial systems, which made things really messy in terms of unification. Also, under the Articles, there was no Supreme Court, and there was no president yet. So we actually spent much of the first decade and a few extra years of American history without actually having a president. George Washington isn't president until 1788 and the years following that. Also, you're going to answer a question on this in a second. Shays' Rebellion exposed a lot of problems. And it's extremely ironic because what it was post-revolution, a bunch of citizens in Massachusetts were really annoyed with the Massachusetts government overtaxing Massachusetts citizens. And they felt the Massachusetts government was oppressive on its citizens because the Massachusetts government had debts to pay off from the American Revolution. So these Shayites rebelled against the Massachusetts government. And it's greatly ironic because Massachusetts features the city of Boston, which was one of the most revolutionary cities against the British for the exact same thing, overtaxation in order to pay off debts from a war. And the same Massachusetts citizens do the same thing against the Massachusetts state government following the American Revolution. It is an incredibly ironic moment. It's got to be squashed through a private militia, and it's showing that even though we won the war, our government systems are kind of a mess right now. Massachusetts citizens revolting against their own government because of overtaxation after the British are long gone. There's also a lot of legislative inefficiencies. For example, in the Articles, each state only had one vote while passing laws, which made things messy, and with only 13 votes, it was overly simplified. Also, if you wanted to amend or update the Articles of Confederation or add like a new clause to it, you need to have a unanimous consent. If you guys know anything about voting or getting people to agree, getting unanimous consent in anything, where should we order pizza tonight, is really, really tough. So when you're talking about adjusting a system of government needing unanimous support, that was incredibly difficult, and it made the Articles not be able to grow and develop in the short-lived time that the Articles were our central government in the U.S. Long story short, the Articles were too weak. They were a nice attempt to organize our government, but they did not have the power needed to be an effective central government for the reasons I've listed off in this slide right here. You're going to pause this video. You have a quick, or you can answer it as I explain it, a little knowledge check. I want you to tell me, just show me that you're paying attention. Answer before you move on to the next slide. Why was Shays' Rebellion incredibly ironic? Answer that before you move on with the video. Yes, the guy that had the musical written after him, a young Alexander Hamilton saved basically a convention that had not a whole lot of purpose because only 5 states even showed up to it in Maryland, called the Annapolis Convention. But what Hamilton does is he says, hey, states, we got to get together, we got to organize, and we got to either fix the Articles of Confederation or possibly get rid of them and put something new in. So he summoned, along with some others, a convention that will go down in American history in the summer of 1787 that would occur in Philadelphia. And that's just what happens. 55 representatives from 12 states, stubborn, independent-minded Rhode Island doesn't show, so only 12 states attend what would become the legendary closed-door Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. Couple big names are there. George Washington, unsurprisingly, is elected chair. Ben Franklin is sort of the elder statesman at hand. And then other names like James Madison emerge as key builders, he's from Virginia, of what would become the Constitution. Also, what might surprise you is a lot of revolutionaries are absent. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams are overseas at this time. And names like Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, John Hancock, they're absent. They were revolutionaries. They were about tearing down governments. And now it was time for a new generation to build a government that could last for multiple centuries. So a lot of names you think might be there were actually not present as they debated creating a new constitution. I think I have a table set up. they're not political parties yet. That's very important. They're not political parties, but factions started to emerge at this constitutional convention. Federalists were people who wanted to create a new constitution, wanted to get rid of the articles. Leaders like Washington, Franklin, Madison, and Hamilton supported this and would have been known as Federalists. They were usually a bit more organized, educated, and wealthier, and were okay with the idea of America's government being a little bit more powerful. At the same time, you had anti-federalists who were much, much more nervous about creating a constitution and wanted the power to be left almost completely in states' hands the way it had been since the Declaration of Independence. A lot of their leaders, like Adams and Henry and Richard Henry Lee from Virginia and Thomas Jefferson, were anti-federalists, but they also weren't at the convention, which is one reason a constitution gets created. They saw themselves as representing more farmers and poor classes. They were very wary of government control, and they called for something that they'll eventually get, just not initially. They called for a Bill of Rights that would protect individual liberties because they were so worried about the government being too controlling and powerful if a constitution was created. Okay, so you have not political parties yet. We don't even have a constitution now at this point, but you have factions and different ideologies emerging in this constitutional convention and the debates that would surround during it and then after it and the decisions that they make. Compromise is key. One big issue in the Constitutional Convention was what representations should each state receive in a Congress moving forward. And what would happen is you have different opinions from different states. So, for example, Virginia, they wanted representation in Congress to be based solely on the population of a state. That would make sense because Virginia was, I think, the most populated state, so they wanted to have the most representation in Congress. States like New Jersey proposed equality no matter how big your state was, so they could have equal representation to a New York, a Pennsylvania, and a Virginia, so that they could have their own interests backed in Congress. And what the Constitutional Convention agreed on was what's known as the Great Compromise, or sometimes the Connecticut Compromise, which decided the Congress that we have even today in 2025. What they decided was we're going to have two branches of Congress. We're going to have a Senate, and we're going to have a House of Representatives. And the Senate will follow the New Jersey plan. And every state, no matter what, will get two senators. The House of Representatives will be different, and that will follow the Virginia plan, and that will be determined based on a state's individual size and population. AKA, Congress will be split into two under one umbrella of the legislative branch. And that's the reason, even to this day, California, Indiana, Wyoming, Florida, it doesn't matter, they all have two senators. And it's why the House of Representatives, California might have 53 representatives, Wyoming might have 1, Indiana might have 9. It's based on the population of the state, whereas senators follows that New Jersey plan of equal representation, and we still follow that to this day. Read this, pause, you might even be able to answer it right away as the video still plays. I want you to read this passage from a book called Founding Brothers, and all you need to do in answering your lesson is tell me what is marked out or crossed out or unreadable. It's a singular word. It's used both times where it is blacked out. Write what is the missing word. Should be pretty straightforward, I think. Pause it if you need to. Again, compromise was key. What the Constitutional Convention will decide on are a lot of things that are still present and integrated into our Constitution. For example, the idea of having an executive branch with a president of the United States is created. A judicial branch where we would have a Supreme Court is created. The idea of how we elect our presidents with the Electoral College, where each state candidates vie to win that state and then gain the electoral votes. By the way, how in the world you see these maps around presidential election time are those numbers determined? It's your number of senators plus your number of people in the House of Representatives. So for example, the state of Indiana, we have 2 senators, because every state gets 2. And we have 9 people in the House of Representatives, aka if you win the state of Indiana, Donald Trump has, I believe, the last 3 elections, Donald Trump won 11 electoral votes to get to the 270 he would have needed. He's won 2, he's lost 1. The 270 votes you need to become president. They also created an easier path to making amendments. There was no Bill of Rights in the initial Constitution, but as amendments like voting for women, voting for 18-year-olds, limiting presidential terms, freedom of speech, right to bear arms, as amendments were passed, they made it easier to create those than the unanimous version that was under the Articles of Confederation. Slavery was, of course, the word, or slaves was, of course, the word in your fill-in-the-blank question check. Slavery is only mentioned basically 3 times in the Constitution. Make sure in your notes, guys, I have simplified language, but you're only filling in what's in bold. You have the 3/5 compromise, which was all about determining how slaves should be counted in the population of the United States. It's a very misunderstood thing. I have a video. If you're confused by this, I would say that's an optional one. I would watch it, especially if this confuses you. But it's twisted American history because it's odd. The southern states, they wanted slaves to be counted as a whole person so they could increase their state's population, so they could send more people to Congress to protect slavery. And northern states actually wanted slaves to not be counted, or be counted as less of a person, so that southern states couldn't have more representation in Congress. So it's kind of opposite. It's like you have to flip your mind around. Southern states wanted slaves to be counted as a person, but not because they wanted to abolish slavery, but because they wanted to protect it. But again, they don't use the word slaves in the Constitution. There was also a slave trade clause, which basically said the international slave trade could not be banned for another 20 years. The phrase such persons is used in the Constitution. And then also there was the Fugitive Slave Act, which basically created the idea that slaves were property, and if they crossed state lines, they needed to be returned to proper ownership moving forward. But as you saw from that passage, the Constitution, slavery is very much addressed, but it was very carefully worded, using phrases like other persons, such persons, and no person, because it was such a delicate issue in the Constitutional Convention. So much so that people like George Mason refused to sign the Constitution because they disagree with the pro-slavery policies that are subtly ingrained into the Constitution, or were ingrained into the Constitution upon its initial creation. That is our modern system of federal government today. Congress, 2 branches, the executive branch and the judicial branch, the checks and balances that come with it, and our 3 branches of government that we have today. That's what they created in Philadelphia in 1787. With all this said, Constitution's created. They come out of Philly in 87. That doesn't mean it's approved. The states had to adopt or agree to the Constitution to increase the power of the central government. Needed 9 of the 13 states to be ratified and to become official. Delaware goes first, but it's a long process. New Hampshire becomes the 9th in June, the summer of 1788. But a lot of states, including Virginia and New York, which actually consider just being their own individual countries, which is wild to think about. And then independent-minded North Carolina and Rhode Island were very, very wary. Look at that political cartoon, motivating these states, please, please, please join the Constitution or ratify it. But they were so wary of too much federal government control if the Constitution was ratified and added to the United States. Eventually, they begin to concede, with Rhode Island signing in May of 1790, the 13th of the 13, to agree to the Constitution. One reason that the Constitution does eventually get agreed upon is something called the Federalist Papers, which are some of the most important historical documents in American history. They were basically 85 articles written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, who, yes, did the bulk of them, I think 53 of the 85, and John Jay. They promoted the Constitution. It's some of the best political writing in American history, and it really laid a framework for why the Constitution was important and why it was necessary for the governance of America moving forward. And it's some of the most important political writing. I put it on the level of common sense in the Declaration for motivating the United States that would come around the corner through the development of the Constitution. James Madison, yes, Hamilton wrote the most through his Federalist Paper 51 and 10 is probably the most famous. His articles 10 and 51 are mostly considered to be the most famous, with language like this, basically explaining why the Constitution needed to be created. This would be the one video, don't worry, it's about 2 minutes, that I would tell you to watch. It's on the Federalist Papers. It does a great job breaking down the ratification of the Constitution. Take a pause from the video, click the link, watch this video, and then come back for the last slide or two. Okay, long lesson, I know, but it's an important one. There's an argument to be made that the ratification of the Constitution was just as revolutionary as winning the revolution. The fact that they were able to take one format of government in the Articles of Confederation, completely change it, debate over it, get states to ratify it, and not have another revolution or some kind of a military coup break out with like large-scale executions is unreal. And the fact that all 13 of the original founding states eventually ratified the Constitution is absolutely incredible. That being said, Americans love promoting the idea of we the people written in the Constitution, but in a lot of ways, the passing of the Constitution was a win for the elite and a win for big government. It created lifetime judge appointments in the Supreme Court. The president isn't directly elected by the people, and initially neither were senators. And in the original Constitution, it's coming right around the corner, but in the original Constitution, there is no Bill of Rights protecting individual liberties. So there's a real argument to be made that the Constitution was actually a win for government power and the politically and financially elite, and not so much a win for the regular commoners that promoted the revolution in the first place. So you're going to see a pendulum going back and forth on government power and individual liberties in America, and finding out what is the sweet spot for the growth and progress of America. With that said, you can go back, of course, to any part of the video to get done what you need. That's the lesson. Only thing you have to do to finish this out, it's a very easy, at the bottom I'm showing you right here. You look at statements and you determine if they're Federalist in nature or anti-Federalist in nature. If you're confused by that, go back and look at that table in the middle of the lesson that you filled out, and then you write down or summarize in your own words key arguments that each the Federalist and the anti-Federalist had. After you have that finished, feel free to do that with a partner if you want, by the way. That should take like 10 minutes. You can have the rest of class and then also use your homework to update study guides, self-reflect, and kind of get set up to be assessed on chapters 6, 7, and 8 when I come back from my trip, more than likely in class on Wednesday and Thursday. So hopefully this wasn't too long. Thank you for following, filling out the notes, the self-checks, all that kind of stuff. Email me if you have any questions, and you should see me Monday or Tuesday and Wednesday at the very latest. Have a great rest of your day.